There are fathers who give birth to children to love, and there are fathers who give birth to children to sell. Elena Whitmore was the second kind. At 22, she was traded like a commodity by her own father and brother to pay off gambling debts they couldn't bring themselves to admit. No goodbyes, no choice. Only a bitterly cold winter night, a horse, and the thick darkness of the frontier swallowing her up step by step. But they never knew who Elena Whitmore really was. Like and comment the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. Stay tuned to the end, because this is the story of a woman who broke an empire. The smell hit her first. That was always how it was in the Whitmore house. You smelled it before you saw it. Sour mash and something underneath, something older and sourer still, the particular rot that settles into wood when a place has been unhappy for too long. Elena stood at the top of the narrow stairs, one hand braced against the wall, and listened. Voices below. Two of them. Her father's she recognized without effort. Harlan Whitmore had a voice like gravel scraping a tin pan, rougher than usual tonight, which meant he'd been drinking since before supper. The second voice was her brother's, and that was the one that made her go still. Dustin Whitmore did not come home often. He lived in Caldwell now, or said he did, though nobody in the family had ever seen proof of an honest occupation. He showed up 4, maybe 5 times a year, always with a fresh story and empty pockets, and he and their father would disappear into the front room and talk in low voices until they either came out laughing or came out angry. There was no in-between with the Whitmore men. Tonight, they were laughing. Elena descended 3 stairs, just enough to hear. Guaranteed, I'm telling you, Pharaoh's been looking for a woman to run the domestic side of that operation for 2 years. Someone young enough to work, old enough not to cause a scene every 5 minutes, and he'll take the Hensley debt off the books? Her father's voice, greedy and careful at once. The Hensley debt and the Pickett account. All of it, cleared. Plus he'll give us the grazing rights on the lower 40 through spring. A pause, the clink of glass. It's a good deal, Pa. Better than anything we're going to get off this land. She won't go willing. She doesn't have to go willing. Dustin's voice dropped, but not enough. She just has to go. Elena stopped breathing. For a moment she stood there on the 3rd stair, the wood cold through her sock feet, and she thought she must have misunderstood. Because the alternative, the thing her mind was starting to piece together from Pharaoh's name and domestic side, and she just has to go. That wasn't something that happened. Not to her, not in the year of 1879 in a country that had supposedly settled the matter of ownership. Except it did happen. She knew it happened. She'd heard whispers about it her whole life, the way frontier women talked in low voices about girls who disappeared, girls whose families had debts, girls who ended up on remote ranches with no way to get word out. She just had never thought it would be her name in the whispers. She moved back up the stairs without making a sound, which was a skill she'd developed over years of living with men who drank. Back in her room, she stood in the center of the floor and looked around at the few things she owned and made herself think clearly, which was hard when her heart was hammering the way it was. She had maybe an hour, maybe less. Dustin was the type to want things settled quickly, and their father was the type to agree to anything that erased a debt. The window was already cracked for cold air. She'd kept it that way since September. She started moving. Elena had never thought of herself as a resourceful woman, exactly. She'd survived, which was different. Survival was mostly just stubbornness dressed up as competence. You kept doing the next thing because stopping wasn't an option, and eventually you'd done enough next things that people called it capability. She'd been doing that her whole life on this farm, cooking and cleaning and mending and hauling while her father drank away what little they earned, and her brother blew through town twice a year with schemes that never panned out. She'd told herself it would change. She'd believed that for an embarrassingly long time. She stopped believing it about 3 years ago when she overheard her father tell a neighbor that Elena would probably marry off the place eventually, save him the trouble of feeding her. He'd said it the same way he might describe selling a cow. Not unkindly, just practically. Like she was an asset he hadn't figured out how to liquidate yet. Now apparently he'd figured it out. She took the wool coat from the hook by the window, the one with the repaired elbow that she'd sewn herself 3 times over. She took the small tin of money she kept in the loose floorboard under the bed. $14 and some change. Everything she'd managed to save over 2 years of selling eggs and mending clothes for the women in Ridgeline. She took her mother's ring, which had no value except that it was the only thing in the house that had ever belonged to someone who loved her. And she took the knife she kept under her mattress, the short one with the handle wrapped in leather, because she wasn't stupid and she wasn't naive and she was leaving in the dark. Then she went out the window. The barn sat 40 feet from the house, and those 40 feet were the most dangerous part. The ground was frozen hard enough to crunch underfoot, and the temperature had dropped since sundown to something that hurt when you breathed in. Elena crossed the distance half running, bent low like it would somehow make her less visible in the open dark, and she made it to the barn door and slipped inside and stood there in the smell of hay and horses and let herself exhale. 3 horses in the stalls. Her father's old roan, which was 20 years old and mean about it. The farm horse, good for pulling and nothing else. And then the bay mare in the last stall, the one her father had won in a card game 18 months ago and never properly broke because he lost interest halfway through. Elena had finished breaking her herself, quietly, over the course of 4 months, in the early mornings before anyone was awake. She'd named her Pepper, which her father thought was the farm horse's name, because Elena had always kept things where Harlan Whitmore couldn't reach them. "Hey, girl," she said softly, putting her hand on the mare's neck. Pepper's ears went back and then forward. "I know, it's cold. We're going anyway." She saddled her in the dark, working by feel and memory, and she was halfway through cinching the girth when the barn door opened and the light from a lantern spilled across the floor. She didn't freeze. Freezing was the wrong instinct. She finished the cinch and turned around, and there was Dustin in the doorway, and he was already reaching the same conclusion she was, because his expression went from confused to hard in less than a second. "The hell are you doing?" he said. Not a question. "Leaving." He stepped inside and let the door fall shut behind him, which was a calculated move. She'd watched him make calculated moves her whole life and recognized them the way you recognize your own handwriting. He wanted to keep this quiet. He didn't want their father involved yet, probably because the deal with Pharaoh required Elena to be delivered in a condition that made a scene unlikely. "You heard us talking," he said. "I heard everything." "Elena." He held up a hand, the reasonable brother, the one who could always explain why something bad was actually fine. "Listen to me. This isn't what you think. You told Pa she just has to go. In what world is that not what I think? Pharaoh runs a legitimate operation. Stop talking," she said. He kept talking. That was the Whitmore way. "Good money, good situation. You'd be running a household, not—" "It's not what you're imagining. You've always been dramatic." "I said stop." She stepped forward and past him, leading Pepper toward the door, and she felt rather than saw him move to grab her arm. She turned fast and put the knife between them, not threatening exactly, just present, just there the way it needed to be, and he stopped. Dustin Whitmore was not a brave man. He was a man who operated through leverage and timing and other people's desperation, and he had never in his life had a knife in his face. He went still the way a dog goes still when something unexpected happens, all the calculation temporarily knocked out of him. "Don't," she said. The single word was very quiet. He didn't. She walked Pepper out of the barn and mounted up in the frozen yard, and she didn't look back at the house, didn't look at the window where her father would still be sitting with his whiskey and his sense of things resolved, and she pointed Pepper north toward the ridge trail and asked her to run. Pepper ran. The cold was something else entirely once she was moving. At the farm, cold was a static fact, something you dressed against and moved around and managed. On horseback in the dark in mid-January, cold became a presence, something actively trying to get inside you. It found the gap at her collar and the edge of her coat where her wrists stuck out, and it crawled up through the saddle, and she rode with her jaw clenched against chattering and tried to think about where she was going instead of how cold she was. North was instinct more than plan. North meant higher ground, which meant fewer roads, which meant fewer people who might recognize her. She knew the ridge trail reasonably well. She'd ridden it a handful of times in summer, picking berries and just getting away from the house for an hour. In the dark in January, it was a different thing entirely. The trees closed in and the trail narrowed, and she had to slow Pepper to something careful, picking through frozen ruts and icy patches by the pale half-light of a moon that was doing barely enough. She tried to think about Pharaoh. She knew the name the way everyone in the territory knew it. Not clearly, not specifically, but the way you know a smell in a room, present and slightly wrong. Wade Pharaoh ran the Crossbar Ranch, which was the largest operation in the valley, and possibly in 3 surrounding counties. He had money the way some men had weather, constantly, naturally, without apparent effort. He employed a lot of people. He had a lot of friends and a lot of offices in Kasen City. He had been married once, briefly, to a woman who had died under circumstances that nobody discussed in specific terms, but that everyone seemed to have an opinion about. The thing about Wade Pharaoh was that he operated in the gap between what the law said and what the law enforced. A lot of men did that on the frontier. Pharaoh just did it more systematically than most. She'd heard over the years things that hadn't quite connected until tonight. A girl from the Mercer farm, gone. A woman from outside Pullman who'd been sold in a paper marriage and never managed to get word to her family afterward. The way Pharaoh's foreman talked about women when he came into town, the particular casual contempt of a man who understood them primarily as resources. She rode through the dark, and she did not let herself cry, which was a conscious choice. She would cry later, maybe, when she was somewhere safe, when safe was a thing that existed. She heard the riders at about 2 in the morning. She'd been following the ridge trail for close to 4 hours by then, moving carefully in the dark, and she'd made decent distance, but not the kind of distance you make when people are actively looking for you. The sound reached her through the trees, hoofbeats, multiple horses, coming faster than anyone would ride that trail at that hour, for innocent reasons. She pulled Pepper off the trail into the trees without hesitating and sat still in the dark and watched the trail and counted. 4 riders, all men, moving with the directional purpose of people following specific instructions. One of them had a lantern. In its moving light, she could see the rifles across their saddles. She pressed her hand over Pepper's nose and the mare stayed quiet, because she was a good horse and because Elena had spent 4 months earning that trust, and she waited until the sound died away up the trail before she moved again. They were ahead of her now, which meant the trail was compromised. She turned Pepper east into rougher country, picking through brush and rocky ground by the limited moonlight, and she tried not to think about how many riders might be out tonight and how few roads she knew in this part of the territory. The temperature was still dropping. She could feel it in her feet now, which had gone from cold to painful to something quieter than pain, which was worse. She rode east until the trees thinned out, and she found herself above a narrow canyon she half recognized, a long ravine that ran down toward the lowlands. The trail she'd known had come from the south. She didn't know this approach at all. She started down into it anyway, because east was still better than back. Yick. She was a third of the way down the canyon wall when the men found her. She didn't know where they came from. From below, maybe. Which meant they'd come around the long way. Or there were more of them than she'd thought. 2 riders appeared at the bottom of the canyon, and 2 more materialized above and to her right, coming off a shelf of rock she hadn't known was there. And suddenly she was in the middle of a box with no good exit, and Pepper was skittering sideways on the frozen slope, and Elena was holding the reins with both hands and trying not to slide. "Elena Whitmore," one of the riders below called up. His voice carried easy and flat in the cold air. "Your family wants you home." She didn't answer. "There's a reward posted. That means we're getting paid either way." He urged his horse a few steps up the slope. "Makes more sense for you to come quiet. Save everybody some trouble." She looked at the walls of the canyon, looked at the riders above her, looked at the 2 below, counted the rifles. She had a knife and a terrified horse and $14. She didn't move. The rider below sighed like this was exactly the inconvenience he'd expected. "Boys," he said, and the 2 riders above started coming down the slope toward her. What happened next came from her left. A single rider, coming out of the dark of the canyon at a speed that didn't make sense for the terrain. A big horse, a dark horse, moving with the reckless confidence of something that had covered this ground before, and the rider was low on its neck, and he came through the 2 men at the bottom of the canyon before they fully registered him, not charging at them directly. threading between them close enough that both their horses shied violently, and in the confusion he angled up the slope toward Elena. "Get on the back," he said. His voice was flat and matter-of-fact, the voice of someone giving instructions they expected to follow, and she had a half-second to decide. She decided. She swung off Pepper's back and caught the back of his saddle and pulled herself up as he turned the horse, and Pepper, bless her, brave girl that she was, followed instinctively, because horses know horses, and they were moving before the men below had finished swearing. A shot went off. Then another. Both wide, fired by men trying to control spooked horses at the same time. And then the canyon wall turned, and they were around it, and the shots stopped echoing, and all she could hear was hoofbeats. She didn't ask where they were going. She held on to the back of the saddle with both hands, and she rode. The man didn't speak for almost 20 minutes. She'd gotten a look at him by then, tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat that had seen better decades, with the kind of stillness that some men had that was less about being calm and more about having already made all their decisions. He rode like someone who'd been on horseback his whole life and forgot it was something you had to think about. When he finally slowed the horses to a walk, they were on a different ridge entirely, moving through a stand of pine that blocked the wind and made the cold slightly less violent. He turned and looked at her for the first time. He had a hard face. Not mean, there was a difference, but the kind of hard that comes from weather and consequence. The face of a man who'd been outside in real conditions for real years. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she thought, with dark eyes that were doing a significant amount of assessment. "Your name, Elena Whitmore?" he said. "Yes?" "Harlan Whitmore's daughter." Unfortunately. Something shifted in his expression, not quite humor, close to it. "Colt Maddox," he said. "You've probably heard of me." She had. Everyone in 4 counties had heard of Colt Maddox. The things she'd heard were not reassuring exactly, but she was 22 years old in the dark in January with bounty hunters behind her and a violent ranch boss waiting to collect her like a debt payment. And reassuring had stopped being the standard she was working with about 6 hours ago. "Why did you help me?" she said. He looked back at the trail ahead. "Because I know what Pharaoh does with women who can't say no," he said. "And because I have a particular problem with men who operate that way." "And that's it?" "That's enough, isn't it?" She thought about it. "Where are we going?" "My ranch, up in the higher pasture. Nobody comes up there much." He paused. "You'll have your own room. You can leave any time you want, soon as you think it's safe." "And if I decide it's never safe?" He glanced at her again. The almost humor was back. "Then I suppose you'll be staying a while." She rode behind him through the dark and the cold, and she thought about what safe meant and whether she'd ever been it and what it might feel like when she got there. She didn't have answers yet, but for the first time since she'd stood at the top of those stairs and listened to her father sell her future like a gambling debt, she was moving toward something instead of just away. The ranch appeared out of the dark just before dawn. It wasn't what she expected, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something stark, maybe, given the man who lived there. It was stone and timber, built against the back of a ridge like it had decided to become part of the mountain rather than fight it. Low and solid and unglamorous, with a barn to the side and a water trough that had a skin of ice across the top. Smoke from the chimney, which meant someone had kept a fire going. Or maybe he always kept a fire going, the kind of man who kept fires going regardless. He dismounted and she followed, her legs less steady than she would have liked after hours in the cold. She didn't say anything about it. He didn't comment either. Inside was plain. A table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace doing serious work, a kitchen that was functional rather than decorated. No evidence of a woman's presence, which tracked with what she'd heard about him. The Maddox Ranch had a reputation as a place men didn't go unless they were invited and didn't stay unless they had reason. He hung his coat on a hook by the door and moved to the fireplace to add wood without ceremony. She stood just inside the door because she hadn't been told where to put herself. "Sit down," he said. "You look like you're about to fall over." "I'm fine." "You've been riding in the cold for 5 hours and your lips are blue. Sit down." She sat down. He put coffee on. They didn't talk while it heated, and she was obscurely grateful for that. She'd had enough in the last several hours to be grateful for silence. When he put the tin cup in front of her, she wrapped both hands around it and let the heat work its way into her palms, and she looked across the table at this man she'd heard about in whispers and ghost stories and frontier gossip, and she tried to figure out what she actually knew. What she actually knew was this. He'd pulled her out of a box canyon in the dark when he had no obligation to, and he'd brought her to his house and made coffee, and he hadn't tried anything or said anything that made her reach for the knife in her coat. That was more than she could say for most men she'd encountered. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said, not looking up from his own cup. "I'm not," she said. He looked up at that. She met his eyes and held them. "I'm not afraid of much right now," she said. "I think I used up all my fear tonight. What I am is tired and cold, and I need to think." She looked at the fire. "My brother sold me. My father agreed to it. There are bounty hunters in the canyon, and somewhere there's a man named Pharaoh who thinks he owns my future." She let that sit. "Being afraid of you would require energy I don't have." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" he said. "Right now, sleep." He nodded, got up, showed her down a short hallway to a room that was small and cold, but had a proper door that latched, and a bed with wool blankets, and a window that looked out on the dark of the ridge. He handed her an extra blanket from a trunk without being asked. "Door latches from the inside," he said. Like it needed to be said. Like he understood exactly why it needed to be said. "Thank you," she said. He went back to the main room without another word. She latched the door. She sat on the edge of the bed in her coat and her cold boots, and she looked at the dark window and thought about her father sitting in that front room with his whiskey and what he might be telling himself right now about what he'd done. She thought about her mother's ring in her pocket. She thought about Dustin's voice. She just has to go. Then she lay down on top of the blankets without taking her boots off, and she closed her eyes and she slept, dreamless and deep, the sleep of a person whose body has decided that enough happened tonight to last a year. She woke to daylight and the sound of horses. For one bad second, she didn't know where she was, and the second after that, she remembered all of it in the particular rushing way that bad nights come back to you in the morning. She was off the bed and at the window before she was fully upright. Outside, 3 riders were coming up the track to the ranch. She recognized one of the horses, the distinctive Palomino belonging to Pharaoh's main foreman, a man named Cruz who came into Ridgeline once a month and who everyone treated with careful politeness because of who he worked for. They'd found the ranch. They'd found it, or they'd known to come here, which meant someone had told them, which meant the whole business of last night in the canyon had not gone as unnoticed as she'd hoped. She heard Colt's boots on the floorboards, moving toward the front door, and she went out of the room and down the hall, and she said, "Pharaoh's men." And he said, "I know," without turning around. He opened the front door before they reached it. Cruz pulled up 10 feet from the porch. He was a big man, heavy through the middle, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from pieces that didn't quite match. He didn't get down from his horse. "Maddox," he said. "Cruz." Colt's voice was exactly the same as it had been last night, flat, informational, like they were discussing weather. "You know why we're here." "You're on my land," Colt said. "So you'd better start explaining." Cruz shifted in his saddle. "Word is you've got a woman on the property. Elena Whitmore, belongs to Mr. Pharaoh by way of a legal contract. Show me the contract." A pause. "I don't have the contract on me." "Then you've got nothing." Colt stepped off the porch into the yard, and something happened to the rider's horses without him doing anything visible. They moved back, all 3 of them, a small, involuntary step, the way animals respond to presence. "You come back to my property without a legal document, without a sheriff, without anything except your boss's say-so, and I will consider that a trespass and respond accordingly." Cruz looked at him for a long moment. His jaw worked like he was thinking about saying something else. He didn't. "This isn't over, Maddox," he said instead. "Most things aren't," Colt said. He stood in the yard and watched them ride away, and Elena stood in the doorway and watched him, and she thought about the way the horses had moved backward without any visible cause, and she thought about what kind of reputation you'd need to make men like Cruz back down without an argument. He came back up the porch steps and went inside, and she moved aside to let him. They'll come back, she said. Yes, he said. With the contract. She paused. Or with more men. Yes. Are you going to tell me I should leave? That I'm trouble you don't need? He looked at her steadily. Are you going to tell me who sold you and how many men are involved in whatever Pharaoh's running out of that ranch? She hadn't expected that question. She thought about it. I know some things, she said carefully. Probably not as much as you. Probably more than you think, he said, because you grew up around it and you've been paying attention even when you didn't know you were paying attention. She hadn't thought of it that way, but he wasn't wrong. $14 and a floorboard, 4 months of secret work with a horse, the careful tracking of who owed what to whom in her father's world. Sit down, he said. Tell me what you know. All of it. She sat back down at the table where she'd had coffee a few hours ago. She started talking. She talked for 2 hours. It came out in pieces, non-linear, the way things do when you've spent years assembling fragments without knowing what picture they were making. She told him about the Mercer girl, who'd been 16 when she disappeared, and whose family had suddenly been able to pay off their land debt the following spring. She told him about a woman named Bessie Crane who'd worked at the dry goods in Ridgeline for a year and a half, and then stopped showing up, and how Mrs. Holt at the store had said Bessie moved on and said it in the voice people use when they mean the opposite. She told him about her father's gambling debts and the specific names she'd overheard, Hensley, Pickett, and how those weren't just money owed to individuals but to something larger, some structure that Pharaoh's operation sat in the middle of. Colt listened without interrupting. He had a quality of stillness that she was starting to understand was actual listening, not patience performance. He was processing, connecting, filing things away. How many ranches do you think are in debt to Pharaoh? She asked, when she'd run out of things she knew. At least 8 in this county, probably twice that across the territory. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. He's been running this for years. The gambling connections pull men in, the debts give him leverage, and when the leverage isn't enough. He stopped. He takes daughters, she finished, among other things. She sat with that. You've been watching him. For a while. Because I know a family that lost someone to him, he said. Simple. Final. 4 years ago. Before I knew what I was looking at. She didn't ask him which family. It wasn't her business. Can he be stopped? She said instead. He looked at her. There was something behind his eyes that was harder to read than the rest of him. He's stopped when there's proof. The kind that can't be buried or bought off. He paused. He keeps contracts, written agreements, because men like Pharaoh believe in documentation. It makes everything look legitimate, gives them something to hold over the people they borrowed from or bought from. He turned his cup again. If someone could get to those contracts, where are they? His office at the Cross Bar. A beat. Which is a very defended place with men who are paid specifically to keep people out. She thought about that. She thought about the tin of money in her pocket and the knife in her coat and $14 and the particular way Cruz had looked at her when she'd stood in the doorway, not recognizing her as someone who mattered, just as an object that had gotten loose. She thought about what it felt like to be underestimated. I could get in, she said. Colt looked at her with an expression that wasn't dismissal but was close kin to caution. You just spent last night running from his men. I spent last night running, she agreed. That's different from walking in the front door as someone they're not looking for. He was quiet. He needs domestic staff, she said. You told me yourself. He's been looking for someone to run the household operation. She met his eyes. He's looking for a woman nobody would look at twice. Someone who could move through that building without anyone getting nervous. She spread her hands. They're looking for the girl who ran, not the woman who came back. That's a significant risk. Yes, she said. It is. She waited to see if he would try to talk her out of it. He didn't. Not yet, he said. They're expecting something right now. Let it get quiet first. Let them think you got away clean, headed for Casson City or Dalton or somewhere far off. He looked at the window, at the ridge and the sky beyond it. A few weeks. You can stay here. Help with the ranch if you want something to do. And when the attention dies down, We go get the contracts, she said. He looked at her again with that hard-to-read look. We, he said. You know the property. I can get inside. That seems like a reasonable partnership. For a moment she thought he was going to say no, or say something about it being too dangerous, or produce some other objection that men tended to produce when women proposed reasonable things. What he said was, "You any good on horseback?" "I broke my own horse," she said. "Secretly. Over 4 months. While living with a drunk and a con man." The almost humor came back. "All right," he said. The weeks that followed were not what she would have predicted. She'd expected tension, the specific tightrope quality of living in close quarters with someone you didn't know, navigating the unspoken geography of a stranger's space. What she found instead was something more like parallel motion. Colt Maddox ran his ranch with the same economy he seemed to apply to everything. No wasted movement, no noise that didn't need to be made. He fed the horses in the morning before he made coffee. He checked the fence lines after. He cooked in the evening with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who'd been feeding himself alone for years and had made peace with it. She found her place in the rhythm without being told to. She started taking the morning coffee off his hands, and he let her without comment, which she appreciated. She helped in the barn because horses were something she understood and understood well, and he noticed her working with Pepper one afternoon and didn't say anything for a while and then said, "She's steady," which was not a small thing from him. "I know," Elena said. "You did that." "Yes." He nodded and went back to what he was doing. It wasn't warmth, exactly. It was something quieter than warmth and more durable. The recognition between people who have both spent time in real difficulty and don't feel the need to perform around it. 3 times in those weeks, riders came to the edge of the property. Twice they left without incident. Colt met them at the boundary, and the conversation was short, and the kind of short that meant something specific about his reputation. The 3rd time, 2 men came to the barn after dark, and she heard them before Colt did, and she was the one who woke him, and afterward he looked at her with something different in his expression. Not surprised exactly, more like recalibrated. "You sleep light," he said. "I grew up in a house with men who came home drunk at all hours," she said. "You learn." He thought about that. "You've been taking care of yourself for a long time," he said. "Since I was about 12, she said. "My mother died and someone had to." He didn't offer condolences. She was grateful for that too. What he said was, "You're going to be all right, Elena." It was such a simple thing, such a plain thing. She didn't know why it hit her the way it did, somewhere under the sternum, a kind of ache that wasn't sadness exactly. "I know," she said, which was not quite true yet, but getting truer. What? On the 23rd day, she stood at the kitchen table with a rough drawing Colt had made of the Crossbar Ranch layout, and they planned. The cook's assistant position had come open 2 weeks prior. Colt had found that out through the network of people he seemed to know in ways he never fully explained. A postmaster in Ridgeline, a woman who ran the boarding house in Dalton, a retired lawman who lived alone in the hills and kept track of things. The position paid $3 a week and required someone who could take direction and keep quiet. And the man doing the hiring was not Pharaoh directly, but his household manager, a man named Tibbs who'd never met Elena Whitmore in his life. She would go in as Nell Preston, a widow from over the Kettner Pass, references from 2 ranches that had since closed. Colt had contacts. The details would hold up to a quick check, which was all Tibbs would do. The contracts were in Pharaoh's office, ground floor, east side of the main house. The office locked, but Pharaoh left the key on a hook inside his bedroom door when he wasn't using it, which was a specific piece of information that came from someone who'd worked there before and had since gotten out and owed Colt a very significant favor. She'd have 2, maybe 3 days inside before she needed to be out with what she needed. "Once you have them," Colt said, "you leave. You don't wait. You take what you can carry and you ride." "And you?" He looked at the map. "I'll be positioned. If it goes wrong in there, you won't know in time." "I'll know," he said. She looked at him. She thought about the riders backing up in the yard. She thought about what kind of presence you'd have to be to make trained men flinch without moving. "Okay," she said. She looked at the map one more time. The Crossbar Ranch. Wade Pharaoh's operation, built on debt and fear and the quiet erasure of people who had no power to resist. She thought about the Mercer girl, about Bessie Crane, about all the names she didn't know and the families who would never get answers. She thought about her father's voice. She just has to go. She looked up from the map, and she was ready. Beck. The night before she left, she sat at the table alone for a while after Colt had gone to bed. She took out her mother's ring and set it on the table and looked at it. Gold, thin as a whisper, with a small garnet that had been in the family long enough that nobody remembered where it came from. Her mother had worn it every day of her life, right up until the morning she didn't wake up. And when Elena had found her, she'd taken the ring off her mother's hand because she knew, if she didn't, someone would. She put it back in her pocket. She thought about what she was walking into. She thought about it clearly, without the filter of bravado or necessity, just the facts. She was 22 years old with no official standing, no legal protection, and a plan that required her to successfully impersonate a woman who didn't exist in the house of a man who had people killed when it was convenient. The plan depended on her being invisible, on being exactly what men like Pharaoh expected women to be: unimportant, domestic, present without being seen. She thought she could do that, not because she was weak, because she'd been practicing that specific kind of invisibility for 22 years. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. In the morning, she dressed in the clothes they'd found for her. A plain gray dress, worn but clean. The clothes of a working woman rather than a runaway. She braided her hair differently than she usually did. She had no jewelry except her mother's ring, which she moved to her right hand so it wouldn't look like a wedding ring. She stood in the doorway of the room she'd been sleeping in for 3 weeks, and she looked at the small space and the wool blankets and the window that faced the ridge. And she thought about the fact that she'd latched the door that first night, not because she was afraid of Colt, but out of a lifetime habit of latching doors, and how in 3 weeks she had not once thought about whether she needed to. She came out, and Colt was in the kitchen with coffee. He handed her a cup. They stood there in the early morning of the kitchen, drinking coffee, and she thought about how there was something profoundly ordinary about this moment, and how ordinary had not been something she'd had access to for a very long time. "You ready?" he said. She held the cup, looked out the window at the ridge she'd come over in the dark 3 weeks ago, half frozen and out of options and moving away from everything that had tried to claim her. "Yes," she said. She set the cup down. She walked out to where Pepper was already saddled and waiting. She rode south toward the Crossbar Ranch, toward Wade Farrow, toward whatever came next. She did not look back, but this time she was riding toward something, and she was not going alone. The Crossbar Ranch looked exactly like money that didn't want to explain itself. Elena rode toward it in the thin morning light and took in the details the way Colt had trained her to over 3 weeks of preparation, not as a whole picture, but as individual facts. The main gate was iron, new iron, expensive. The fence line ran straight and tight, better maintained than any fence she'd seen on working ranches in the territory. 2 men at the gate, both armed, both wearing the same style of canvas coat that meant they were Pharaoh's hired hands rather than actual cowboys. Working cowboys dressed for weather and function. These men dressed for intimidation, which was a different thing entirely. She slowed Pepper to a walk about 100 yards out and composed her face. Nell Preston, widow, tired, unremarkable. She'd practiced this in the mirror at Colt's ranch, such as it was. A small square of glass hung above the wash basin, which gave her about 1/3 of her face at a time. She'd practiced until the version of herself looking back didn't look like Elena Whitmore running from anything. "Morning," she said to the gateman. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm here about the cook's assistant position. Man named Tibbs sent word to the Dalton boarding house." The taller of the two looked at her with the particular appraisal men gave women when they'd decided in advance how much the woman mattered. He found what he expected: plain dress, tired horse, unremarkable face under a practical hat, and his shoulders dropped a fraction. "Tibbs is up at the house," he said. He pulled the gate open without further examination. She rode through. That was the first test, and it passed the way Colt said it would. Men guarding against threats looked for threats. A woman on a worn-out horse asking about a domestic position wasn't the shape of what they were watching for. She kept her eyes forward and her posture unremarkable, and she didn't look at the bunkhouse to her left or the storage buildings to the right, even though she was cataloging everything. Tibbs was a narrow man in his 50s with ink-stained fingers and the bearing of someone who had once had a more respectable position and had made compromises to get here. He interviewed her in the kitchen, which was large and warm and smelled like rendered lard and coffee, while a heavy-set woman named Dora moved around in the background pretending not to listen. "References?" Tibbs said. She handed him the paper Colt had arranged. 2 names, 2 ranches, both verifiable if he wrote letters, and waited 2 weeks. She was betting he wouldn't wait 2 weeks. He glanced at it, set it down. "You cook?" "I can cook. I'm better at managing, organizing provisions, coordinating schedules, keeping track of what needs doing." He looked at her over his glasses. "Mr. Farrow runs a structured household. He expects things done a certain way. No improvising, no asking questions about things that aren't your concern, no fraternizing with the ranch hands." "That suits me fine," she said. "I'm not looking for conversation. I'm looking for steady work." Tibbs looked at her for another moment. Really looked, the way he probably did with all new staff, trying to detect trouble before it arrived. She met his eyes without challenge. Tired widow looking for a paycheck. Nothing more. $3 a week, room and board, he said. "You start today. Dora will show you the kitchen routine." He picked up the reference paper again, not reading it, just handling it. "Mr. Farrow returns from Casson City tomorrow evening. He'll want to see the new staff at supper." "Of course," she said. He dismissed her with the nod and went back to his ledger, and Elena turned toward the kitchen and Dora, who was watching her with the cautious assessment of a woman who'd survived a difficult place by learning to read new arrivals quickly. "I'm Nell," Elena said. "Dora." She handed her an apron. "You actually know how to cook? Or was that for show?" "I can cook," Elena said. "Good. We're short-handed, and Tibbs doesn't like to hear it." She turned back to the stove. "Stay out of the East Wing. That's Mr. Farrow's office and private rooms. You go in there to clean only when Tibbs says you're supposed to, and only Tibbs says." Elena tied the apron strings. "Understood," she said. The East Wing. Exactly where she needed to go. She spent the first day learning the geography of the place with the specific patience that came from knowing she couldn't rush it. The main house was large by frontier standards. 2 stories, 6 rooms on the ground floor, 4 above, with a back staircase that the household staff used to avoid the main hall. The kitchen was in the northwest corner. The dining room ran along the south face. The parlor and a sitting room occupied the west side. And the east wing, which ran off the main hall behind a door that stayed shut, held Farrow's study, a private sitting room, and what Dora referred to obliquely as the business office. The key, according to Colt's source, hung on a hook just inside Farrow's bedroom door on the second floor. The bedroom was directly above the office. She moved through the kitchen and the dining room and the supply pantry, and she cataloged where things were and who went where and when, and she was careful, and she was quiet, and she was exactly as unremarkable as she needed to be. By evening, she knew the shift patterns of the 2 house staff besides Dora. She knew that the east wing door was checked twice a day by a man named Reeves, who was not a household employee but something else, something that walked like a man who'd hurt people professionally. She knew that the upstairs rooms were only accessed by the back staircase before 9 in the morning, when Tibbs did his rounds. She ate supper in the kitchen with Dora and a young man named Perry, who did general maintenance and said almost nothing. Dora talked enough for all of them, practical chatter about provisioning and what needed ordering and how the laundry situation was a disaster, and Elena listened and nodded and kept her face in the expression of a woman who found all of this reassuringly normal. That night, in the small room off the kitchen where new staff slept, she lay on her back in the dark and thought about Colt positioned somewhere out on the ridge with his rifle and his patients, and she thought, one more day. Wade Farrow arrived the following evening just before dark. She heard the horses before she saw him, and she had a moment to compose herself before the kitchen door opened and Tibbs appeared with the specific tension of a man whose employer was back on the premises. "Get the table set," he said. "Mr. Farrow will want supper in an hour." She carried dishes to the dining room, and she was setting the second place when she heard him in the hall, his voice before his face, which was a pattern she recognized from her father and from Cruz and from every man who ran things through the weight of his own presence. Pharaoh's voice was different from what she'd expected. Quiet, well-modulated. The voice of a man who'd learned that the quieter you spoke, the harder people listened. She didn't look up from the table when he came to the dining room doorway. "New girl?" he said to Tibbs, who was behind him. "Yes, sir. Nell Preston, from over the Kettner Pass. Started yesterday." A pause. She kept her hands on the silverware, aligning it, a woman focused on her work. "Fine," Pharaoh said. He moved away down the hall, and she let out a breath so carefully it made no sound. She'd seen him in that peripheral look she'd allowed herself. 50 or so. Heavy through the chest, carrying it well the way men who'd been physically powerful sometimes carried weight in middle age. Gray at the temples. The face of someone who'd made a great many decisions and found the process easy. She thought about the Mercer girl. She thought about Bessie Crane. She set the last fork in place and went back to the kitchen. She got into the East Wing on the third morning. Not the office, not yet, but far enough. Tibbs had assigned her to dust the private sitting room that connected to the office hallway, which she understood was a kind of test, a chance to see if the new staff could be trusted near the sensitive parts of the house. She moved through the sitting room with a dust cloth and the expression of a woman thinking about what to make for lunch, and she noted the door at the far end and the sound of Reeves moving somewhere beyond it, and she did not try the handle. Not that morning. What she did that morning was find the back staircase access point, confirm that it ran directly past Pharaoh's bedroom door, and identify the particular creak in the third step from the top that would need to be avoided. She also found, tucked into the sitting room bookshelf behind a volume on cattle management, a folded paper that she almost didn't take out. She took it out. It was a list of names, 12 of them, with numbers beside each. Not dollar amounts she recognized as wages or fair prices. The numbers were too low for land value. They were the kind of numbers attached to people when people are being priced. She put it back exactly as she'd found it. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that. On the fourth night, she went up the back stairs. She'd waited until the house settled, which took until past midnight. Pharaoh kept late hours, she'd learned, working in his office until 11, or sometimes later, a habit that Dora mentioned in the way of established fact. She'd lain in her room for 2 hours, listening to the house go quiet around her, tracking the sounds, the creak of floorboards above as he moved through his rooms, the eventual silence that meant he'd gone to bed. She gave it another hour after that. The back staircase was exactly where she'd assessed it. Third step from the top. She stepped over it, which was awkward but manageable in sock feet. The hallway at the top was dark and smelled like lamp oil and wood polish, and 3 doors opened off it. The first was a linen closet, which she knew. The second was a small sitting area. The third, at the end of the hall, was Pharaoh's bedroom. She stood outside that door for a moment that felt much longer than it was. She was not brave in the way stories made bravery sound. The absence of fear, the clean certainty of righteousness. She was afraid, specifically and practically afraid, in the way that her legs were slightly unsteady and her mouth had gone dry and some part of her brain was generating a very clear running commentary on all the ways this could go wrong. She opened the door. The room was dark, but not fully dark. Moonlight through the curtain gave her enough. A large bed, and in it the shape of Pharaoh sleeping, the slow, even movement of a man with no present concerns. A bureau, a washstand, and on the back of the door she'd just come through, a row of hooks, 3 hooks, 1 coat, 1 belt, 1 key on a ring, exactly where Colt's source had said. She took the key off the hook with 2 fingers, slow enough not to make a sound, and she backed out of the room and pulled the door shut behind her and stood in the hallway with her heart doing something complicated in her chest. She had the key. She went back down the stairs, stepped over the 3rd step, made the kitchen. She put the key in the pocket of her dress, and she stood in the dark kitchen for 30 seconds, and then she put water on for coffee she wouldn't drink just to have something to do with her hands. The office the next morning. She'd worked out the timing carefully. Pharaoh rode out with his foreman every morning at 7:30 for a survey of the ranch operations, which took him 90 minutes on average. Reeves went with him. Tibbs was occupied with provisioning accounts between 8 and 9. Dora worked the kitchen and didn't leave it during breakfast cleanup. She went in at 7:45. The office was organized the way meticulous men organized their secrets, the surface deliberately plain, the actual material kept below it. A wide desk, a row of locked cabinets along the east wall, a safe she'd known about and didn't try. The locked cabinets were what she wanted. The key opened the middle one. Inside, ledger books, paper documents in folded sets, a wooden box of smaller papers bound with twine. She moved through them with focused speed. She was looking for contracts, the kind Colt had described, the written agreements that documented what Pharaoh's network had done, names and amounts and signatures that turned a system of fear and debt into something that could be proven in a court. She found them in the third ledger. Not all of them. She couldn't know how many there were, but enough. Documents bearing the names of families she recognized, papers that described in the careful language of legal transaction things that were not legal transactions. The Mercer family's debt converted into the value of their eldest daughter's domestic service, and what that service actually meant documented in terms that could not be misread. Similar papers for 4 other families. The names of 2 officials in Cassin City who had received payments. The signature at the bottom of each one, W.T. Pharaoh. She couldn't take the originals. They'd know. She'd thought about this. She had paper in her apron pocket, and she had a pencil, and she sat on the floor of Wade Pharaoh's office at 8 in the morning, and she copied names and numbers and dates and specific language in her small practical handwriting, getting down everything that mattered, everything that a lawyer or a judge or anyone with authority and actual integrity would need to understand what had been done. She worked for 35 minutes. She locked the cabinet, replaced the key exactly as she'd found it upstairs, and was in the kitchen helping Dora with the breakfast dishes when she heard the writers come back at 9:15. Her copies were folded into the lining of her coat, sewn in that morning with a needle and thread she'd brought for exactly this purpose. She sent the signal that evening. Colt had arranged it, a specific lamp placement in the small window at the back of the kitchen, visible from the eastern ridge if you knew where to look. Lamp on the left side of the sill meant she had what she needed. Lamp on the right meant she needed more time. Lamp in the center meant something had gone wrong. She put it on the left. She stood at the window for a moment and looked out at the dark ridge, and she thought about a man out there somewhere in the cold reading a lamp signal from a kitchen window, and she thought about how strange it was that she trusted him. Not blindly, not because she had no other options, though options were limited. She trusted him because she'd watched him for 3 weeks, and she'd seen the way he operated, straightforward in the way that people are straightforward when they don't feel the need to impress anyone. He'd pulled her out of a canyon and given her a room with a latch on the door and made coffee and asked her what she knew, and that was more than most people had done for her in 22 years. She turned away from the window. She went to bed early and told Dora she had a headache, and Dora said to drink water, and Elena said she would, and she lay in the dark and thought through the morning. She'd leave at first light. Before the house was fully up, before Tibbs made his rounds, before anyone had occasion to notice that Nell Preston from over the Kettner Pass had packed her few things and saddled her horse and ridden out of the yard without a word of notice, household staff turned over. It wouldn't be the first time. The risk was the gate. The gate men changed shift at 6, and in the shuffle of that, attention was divided. 6 o'clock then. She had the copies of the documents. She had Pepper. She had a plan. What she didn't have yet was a clear sense of what came after she got out, after she got the documents to someone who could use them, after the part where she and Colt figured out what you actually did with proof when the man it would convict had money and connections and his own version of events already prepared. But she'd figure that out when she got there. She was good at figuring things out when she got there. She thought about her brother's voice, she just has to go. She thought about her father agreeing. She thought about a 16-year-old girl from the Mercer farm and a woman named Bessie Crane, and 12 names on a list with numbers beside them. She thought about Colt Maddox on a ridge in the cold, watching a lamp in a window. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep easily, but she had what she came for, and tomorrow she would ride. She was at the gate at 6:04, 4 minutes late because the shift change had gone differently than she'd expected. The incoming guard had arrived early, which meant both men were present at the gate at the same time, talking, which meant she'd had to stand in the shadow of the barn for an extra 4 minutes with Pepper's reins in her hand and her heart making a lot of unnecessary noise. When the outgoing guard finally walked toward the bunkhouse, she led Pepper forward. The remaining man looked at her with the mild confusion of someone processing unexpected information. "Where you headed?" "Got a message from my sister in Dalton. Family situation." She kept her voice at the particular register of a woman who was tired and inconvenienced but not alarmed. "I told Tibbs last night. He said take the morning." Tibbs had said no such thing, but Tibbs was in the main house doing accounts, and this man would not walk up there to check, because that would require initiative, and the kind of men Pharaoh hired for gate duty were selected specifically for their willingness to follow instructions rather than generate them. He stepped aside. "Be back by supper," he said, which was not his call to make but gave him something to say. "Of course," she said. She rode through the gate at a walk, because running was the wrong instinct here. Running was always the wrong instinct when someone was watching, and she held Pepper to a walk for 100 yards and then 200, and then she was around the first bend in the road and out of sight line, and she asked Pepper for everything she had. Pepper gave it. Colt was waiting at the tree line on the eastern ridge, exactly where he'd said he would be. He came out of the trees when he saw her, and she pulled up, and they looked at each other for a moment in the early morning light. And what she saw in his face was not relief exactly. He wasn't built for expressions that obvious, but something close to it, something that loosened in him when he saw her riding upright on her own horse, without anyone behind her. "You got it," he said. Not a question. He could read it on her, apparently. "Copies in my coat lining." She swung down from the saddle, and her legs were steadier than last night, but not by a significant margin. 12 families named in the contracts. 2 officials in Cassin City taking payments. All of it dated and signed. He was quiet for a moment, looking out toward the crossbar. How long before they notice? Could be an hour. Could be by noon when Tibbs goes looking for me. She paused. There's something else. I found a list in the sitting room. Names with numbers beside them. 12 people, and the numbers weren't prices for land or wages. She met his eyes. I think there are more contracts that aren't in that office. Things he keeps somewhere else. Colt's jaw tightened in the small way that meant he was processing something unpleasant. Pharaoh has a second property, he said. Old logging camp up the Mather Valley. I've suspected for a while that's where he keeps the more sensitive operations. So what we have isn't everything. It's enough to start, he said. Enough to take to Judge Calloway in Dalton. If Calloway sees those signatures and those names, he issues warrants. And once the warrants are out, Pharaoh can't make evidence disappear without making things worse for himself. She'd heard of Calloway. Old judge, difficult reputation. Didn't move easily. Will Calloway act on copies, not originals? If the copies are corroborated by someone who can testify they saw the originals, he looked at her. Me, she said. You'd have to stand in front of him and say what you saw. She thought about standing in front of a judge and telling him she'd entered Pharaoh's property under a false name and accessed a locked cabinet with a stolen key. She thought about her word against Wade Pharaoh's, a 22-year-old woman with a drunk for a father and a con man for a brother against a man with money in Cassin City and friends in offices. She thought about the Mercer girl's name on that document with a number beside it. Let's ride, she said. They didn't make it to Dalton. They were an hour out from the ridge, moving through a stretch of open country between 2 stands of timber, when Elena heard it. That particular quality of hoofbeats that meant more than 2 horses and more than a casual pace. She said Colt, and he'd already heard it, and they were moving into the tree line before the riders cleared the hill to the south. 8 of them, armed and moving fast. Not random, directed. Someone had known which way she'd go. She thought about it for a sharp, cold second. The gate man. She'd said Dalton, she'd said her sister in Dalton, and someone had connected that to Colt and Dalton and the most direct road between them. It was her own cover story being used against her. They know the road, she said. Yes. He scanned the tree line, the terrain ahead, the way he did, quickly, without visible urgency. There's a farm about 2 miles north, Henderson's. They're not involved in this, but they know me. He paused. We can't lead armed men to their place. Then we don't go north. No. They sat in the trees and watched the 8 riders reach the road below and split. 4 continuing toward Dalton, 4 pulling up and reading the ground, looking for tracks. One of them had his head down the way a man does when he's following sign. They had minutes, maybe less. "The Mather Valley," Elena said. Colt looked at her. "You said Pharaoh has a second property there. If the rest of the evidence is there, that's the wrong direction. That's deeper into his territory." "Yes," she said. "That's why he won't expect it." He held her gaze for a moment. She could see him running it. The risk calculation, the terrain, the numbers. 8 riders. 2 of them, one with copies of documents sewn into a coat lining. "The logging camp is defended," he said. "Is it more defended than 8 armed men between us and the only judge in reach?" A pause. Not long. "No," he said. They went east. The Mather Valley was 3 hours of hard riding through country that got rougher the deeper in you went. The kind of terrain that discouraged casual travel and rewarded people who knew what they were doing. Colt knew what he was doing. He picked a route that used the ridges as cover, dropping into valleys only where the tree line held, and Elena followed and didn't talk and concentrated on the riding. Her mind kept working the problem. Pharaoh would know by now. The gate man, Tibbs, someone would have added it up. New domestic staff, reference from nowhere solid, disappeared the morning after putting a lamp on the left side of the windowsill. He'd pull apart the sitting room and find the place she'd accessed the bookshelf. He'd check the cabinet and find the copies gone. He was a methodical man, and methodical men traced things backward and found the shape of what had happened. He'd also know Colt Maddox was involved. Maddox had already declared himself when he turned Cruz away from the ranch weeks ago. Pharaoh wasn't the type to let that go unanswered. It was bad for business, the business being fear, which only worked when it worked completely. So he'd send enough men to finish both of them, and he'd do it before they reached anyone with authority, which meant they were probably already cutting off the other roads. She thought about this, and she thought about the copies in her coat lining and the 12 names and the 2 corrupt officials, and she thought, it needs to get to someone tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight, before Pharaoh can reach anyone in Casson City and start managing the story. She pulled up alongside Colt. "The postmaster in Ridgeline," she said. "You said he's someone you trust." "Silas Wen. Yes. Can you get word to him? The copies? If I wrote out a second set, duplicates, and we sent them to Wen with instructions to take them to Callaway if we didn't make contact in 24 hours. Colt thought about it while riding, which meant he wasn't dismissing it. "Wen doesn't ride fast," he said. "He doesn't have to ride fast. He just has to hold the information so Pharaoh can't eliminate it completely by eliminating us." She paused. "We need a backup." He looked at her. Something behind his eyes moved. "You've been thinking about this the whole ride." "I've been thinking about this since the sitting room." He was quiet for another minute. "There's a relay point, old trapper's cabin, about a mile from the Mather property, used by some of the families in the network when they need to pass information without going through town." He paused. "I can leave word there. Someone will get it to Wen." "Does Pharaoh know about the relay?" "If he did, those families would already be worse off than they are." She nodded. "Then we do that first, before the camp." He agreed with a slight inclination of his head, the way he agreed to things that made sense. Not enthusiastically, not with concession, just with acknowledgement. She spent the next 30 minutes in the saddle writing a second copy from memory, balancing the paper on her knee, in the particular thin handwriting she used when she was writing fast. She got down everything essential: names, numbers, dates, the specific language of the contracts that made clear what they documented. Her own name at the bottom, Elena Whitmore, not Nell Preston, because if it came to Callaway without her to testify, it needed a real name attached. She folded it and gave it to Colt. The trapper's cabin was barely a structure, 4 walls and a roof and a floor that had seen better decades, tucked into a fold of rock that made it almost invisible from the trail. Colt went in for 4 minutes and came out without the paper. "Someone will check it by nightfall," he said. "How do you know?" "Because someone always does." He swung back into the saddle. "These families have been surviving Pharaoh for years. They developed habits." She thought about that. The network of small resistances, the relay points and trusted postmasters, and careful habits built up by people who had no official protection and no powerful allies. the quiet infrastructure of people who had decided not to go under. "How many people know what Pharaoh is doing?" she said. "Enough to fill a courthouse." He turned his horse east. "Not enough who have something to hold up in one." Until now, she thought. She didn't say it, the thinking it was enough. The logging camp was visible from the ridge above it, a cluster of buildings in a cleared valley, a main structure that had been a bunkhouse once and was now something else. Two smaller buildings, a corral with 6 horses, 3 men visible from the ridge, which meant more she couldn't see. Colt crouched beside her in the frost-brittle brush, and they looked down at it together. "The main building," she said. "That's where the records would be. If they're here, they're here." She was certain in the particular way she'd gotten certain about things over the past weeks, not on evidence she could articulate, but on the specific wrongness she'd felt standing in Pharaoh's sitting room with a list of 12 names and numbers that weren't prices. Some things you knew by the feeling they left in you. "He keeps the worst of it away from his own property. Easier to deny." Colt studied the layout. She could see him doing the same thing she'd done at the crossbar. Cataloging, calculating, looking for the shape of what was possible. "I can get 2 of those men out of position," he said. "If I come down the south trail visible and slow, they'll respond to me directly." A pause. "That gives you maybe 10 minutes at the main building." 10 minutes. If you're inside in the first 2. "What happens after 10 minutes? He looked at her steadily. "I stop being able to guarantee what happens after 10 minutes. She took that in, not as a threat and not as discouragement, just as information, which was how he delivered most things. "What are you going to do?" she said. "When they see you?" "Talk," he said. "As long as I can talk, I'm not shooting, and neither are they. Pharaoh wants me brought in, not shot in a field. I'm worth more to him as a problem he can manage." He paused. That buys time. She looked at the camp. She thought about 10 minutes and what 10 minutes meant inside an unknown building with men she couldn't account for. She thought about the list in the sitting room bookshelf. 12 names, numbers. "I'll be inside in 2, she said. She went down the north slope while he circled south, moving through the brush on foot. She'd left Pepper ground-tied in the tree line, and she was watching the camp from behind the last stand of trees when she heard Colt's horse come down the south trail at the particular pace that made exactly the right amount of noise. All 3 visible men turned. She ran across 30 feet of open ground to the back of the main building, and her lungs were burning from the cold air and she was making noise she couldn't help, boots on frozen ground, but the noise from the south, Colt's voice now, carrying clear and calm as he identified himself to the men who were reaching for weapons they hadn't drawn yet, covered it. The back door was not locked. Either they relied on remoteness or they were careless, or they'd never had someone come in the back while the front was occupied. She went in. Inside it was dim and cold, a large room that had been a dormitory and now had tables down the center with papers and ledger books stacked on them, a wood stove, not currently lit, and along the east wall a row of locked metal boxes that looked like the kind banks used for deed storage. She went to the tables first. Faster access. What she found in the first 2 minutes was not what she'd expected, not additional contracts like the ones in the office at Crossbar. What she found were movement records, dates and routes and descriptions, the operational documentation of a system that moved people, not just property. Specific routes from 4 counties into the territory and out the other side. Names of receiving parties. Payment records that showed the financial structure of something much larger than one man's operation. Pharaoh wasn't running this alone. He was a node, a significant one, with money and influence and the ability to make things in this territory run smoothly, but connected to something that extended well past these 4 counties. Her hands were not steady when she started copying. She wrote as fast as she could read, abbreviating, shorthand she'd developed doing her father's farm accounts for years when he was too drunk to manage it himself. She got down names and dates and the core structure of the routes, enough to show what it was and who was involved, and she was on her 4th page when she heard the shot. Single shot. From the south side. She didn't stop writing. She finished the line she was on and turned the paper over and kept going, because stopping now meant leaving with less than she could have. Voices outside raised. Not Colt's, the other men's moving, the particular sound of people repositioning. She got one more minute. Maybe 90 seconds. She folded the papers into her coat next to the copies from the crossbar office, and she went to the east wall and looked at the locked metal boxes, and she thought about what she didn't have: a key, time, anything to force them with. Then she looked at the wood stove. The stove had a fire iron hanging beside it, a heavy one meant for managing logs. She took it to the nearest lock and hit it twice, and the third time it gave. And she opened the box, and inside were documents in a different hand than Pharaoh's. Older documents, foundational agreements, the paperwork that predated his operation and showed where the structure had come from. She took the top third of them. Not all. They'd know immediately if all were gone. A third might read as disorganization, papers misfiled for long enough to matter. She went out the back. Then, Colt was on his horse 50 yards up the north slope, and there were 2 men on foot behind him, and they were shouting, but not shooting, which meant he'd been right about being more valuable alive. She ran for the tree line, and she could hear the moment they saw her. The shouts changed register. And then she was in the trees, and Pepper was where she'd left her, and she was up and moving before she'd fully thought it through. She came out above Colt on the slope, and he saw her, and he turned his horse north in the same motion, and they went up the ridge together at a speed that was too fast for the terrain and couldn't be helped, and behind them she could hear horses being pulled from the corral. She was breathing so hard she couldn't speak for the first 10 minutes. When she could, she said, "There's more. Pharaoh is connected to something bigger. I have routes, names, payment records." Colt was breathing hard too, which was the first time she'd seen that. How much more? Enough that Calloway isn't the only one who needs to see this. She pressed her hand against her coat, the shape of folded papers inside. This goes beyond the territory. There are people in Casson City involved, and I think beyond Casson City. He was quiet for a moment, writing. Then we need someone with jurisdiction beyond this territory. Yes. That's a federal matter. Yes, she said again. He looked at the sky like he was calculating distance to dark. There's a federal marshal stationed in Ardmore. 2 days' ride. 2 days. With Pharaoh's men behind them, and the roads watched, and the relay point their only backup, and a coat full of papers that could bring down something much larger than one man's frontier operation. Can we make it in 2 days? She said. His mouth set in the line she'd come to recognize as him making a decision he didn't entirely like. We can make it in 2 days, he said. But we don't stop. She didn't argue. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold, and she rode. Behind her, down in the valley, she could hear the camp coming alive. Horses and shouts, and the sound of a system that had operated in quiet impunity for years, suddenly understanding that something had gone wrong. Good, she thought. Let them understand it. She bent low over Pepper's neck, and she ran. They rode through this first night without stopping. Elena had thought she understood exhaustion before. The bone-deep kind that came from years of farm work and poor sleep and carrying more than one person's share of everything. What she discovered over those hours in the saddle was that she'd only understood one kind. This kind was different. This was the exhaustion that came from sustained fear, from a body that had been producing emergency responses for 2 days straight and was starting to send signals about the limits of that. Her hands cramped on the reins somewhere around 2 in the morning. She didn't mention it. She worked her fingers open and closed and kept riding. Colt set the pace and she matched it, and they communicated mostly in practical shorthand. Which fork, which ridge, how long to water the horses. And the silence between those exchanges was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of silence between people who were past performing composure for each other. Around 4 in the morning, he said, "How are you doing?" Not a question exactly. A check. "I'm fine," she said, which was partially true. He glanced at her. "Your hands were cramping about an hour back." She'd thought she'd handled that without showing it. "They're better. We can stop for an hour before the Mather crossing, rest the horses." "Can we afford the hour? Can we afford to ride into Ardmore on horses that can't walk?" He was already angling toward a stand of trees that had the look of a place he'd used before, deliberate positioning, sheltered from the wind, with a sight line back the way they'd come. She didn't argue. She was learning when not to argue, which was a skill she'd had to develop fast. They stopped for 90 minutes. She didn't sleep. She wasn't capable of sleep, her mind running the same loops it had been running for hours. The documents in her coat and the names on the routes and the shape of what Pharaoh's operation connected to. But she sat with her back against a tree, and she let her body stop moving, and that was something. Colt sat a few feet away. He was watching the back trail with the patience of a man who'd spent significant portions of his life watching and waiting, and after a while he said, without looking at her, "The family I told you about, the one Pharaoh took someone from." She waited. "My sister's friend," he said. "Clara Tibbs, actually. Related to the man who hired you. Her uncle, which is how I eventually learned where the operation was centered." He paused. "She was 18. Her father owed Pharaoh through a bad cattle season and a worse loan. By the time I understood what had happened, she'd been moved twice and the trail was cold." His voice was even throughout. Too even, in the way that people talk about things they've had a long time to harden around. "I've been building toward this for 4 years, gathering what I could gather, staying close enough to watch, not close enough to push prematurely. Because premature would have let him bury it," she said. "Because premature would have gotten people killed and given him time to move his operation." He looked at her then. "What you got out of that camp, the roots, the external connections, that's what I never had. I knew he was connected to something larger. I could feel it in how the money moved and how quickly things got managed when there was a problem. But feeling isn't evidence." She thought about Clara Tibbs, 18 years old, moved twice in 4 years. She thought about whether there was any road that led back to someone like that. She didn't ask. Some questions weren't hers to ask. "We're going to finish this," she said. Not a reassurance, a statement of shared intent. He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "we are." They got back on the horses. They reached Ardmore at late afternoon of the second day. It was larger than Ridgeline, but smaller than Casson City, the kind of town that existed because of its position rather than its character, a supply point and a way station, with the federal marshal's office in a stone building near the center that looked like it had been built to make a specific point about permanence. Elena had not slept in 40 hours. She was aware of how she looked, which was not the way you wanted to look walking into a federal office to make a case that someone needed to take seriously. She'd done what she could with the water in her canteen and the limited provisions of her appearance, which was not much. She went in anyway. Marshal Hector Dade was a compact man in his late 40s with a gray mustache and the eyes of someone who'd heard a great many stories and developed strong opinions about which ones were worth his time. He looked at Elena, then at Colt, then back at Elena, and his expression did not commit to anything. "Maddox," he said. He knew Colt, which was not surprising. "Who's this?" "Elena Whitmore," Colt said. "She has documents I think you need to see." "Documents," Dade repeated. Elena put them on his desk. All of them. The copies from Pharaoh's office, the operational records from the logging camp, the foundational agreements from the metal box. 40-some pages of handwritten copies and original papers, organized in the sequence she'd been working out in her head for 2 days of writing. Dade looked at the stack. He picked up the top page. Read it, set it down, and picked up another. The office was quiet. Outside, a dog was barking at something, and somewhere a wagon was moving over cobblestones, and Elena stood in front of a federal marshal's desk and tried not to shift her weight. He read for 20 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "How did you access Pharaoh's private office?" "Under a false identity, as hired domestic staff." "You took these from a locked cabinet." "Copies. I left the originals. I took originals from the logging camp because I had reason to believe they'd be moved or destroyed before we could return with authority." Dade looked at her with the expression of a man running a calculation. "Pharaoh's lawyers will argue unlawful entry." "Pharaoh's lawyers are welcome to argue whatever they want," she said. "What's in those documents doesn't change based on how I found them. 12 families named in contracts they didn't understand they were signing. Women treated as payment for men's debts. Routes that run people across 4 counties and connect to receiving parties. I don't know, and you might." She kept her voice level, which took more effort than she let show. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to read what's there and tell me it doesn't warrant warrants. Dade set down the page he was holding. He looked at Colt. She always like this? Pretty much, Colt said. Dade sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Not doubt. She read it as the look of a man making a decision he'd already made, just confirming the timeline. I'll need to send to Casson City for 2 deputies, and I'll need to contact Judge Harmon about the federal jurisdiction question, because if these routes go where I think they go, this moves above Calloway's authority. How long? Elena said. 24 hours for the deputies. Harmon is slower. He looked at the documents again. You have somewhere to stay tonight that isn't the road? We'll find somewhere, Colt said. There's a boarding house on Sutter Street. Tell May Hollis I sent you. Dade stood, which was apparently the end of the meeting. Leave these with me. I'll have them back to you when the deputies arrive. Marshal, Elena said, before she could think better of it. There was a girl, Clara Tibbs, moved about 4 years ago, twice since. She'd be 22 now. Dade's expression shifted. Not much. Enough. I know that name, he said quietly. Is she? I don't know, he said. But if she's in the network that these documents describe, finding her is part of the same investigation. He held her gaze. I'll do what I can. It wasn't a promise. It was the best a person in his position could honestly offer. She nodded and she followed Colt out into the afternoon light of Ardmore, and she stood on the board sidewalk and breathed. The 24 hours felt like a week and passed like a day. She slept for 10 of them, which her body demanded without negotiation. When she woke up in the clean, small room at May Hollis's boarding house, disoriented and momentarily uncertain of where she was, she lay still for a moment and listened to the ordinary sounds of a town going about its business, and she thought about how long it had been since she'd been somewhere without the specific quality of threat in the air. She ate. She washed properly for the first time in days. She sat at the small writing table in the room, and she wrote, not documents this time, but a letter. To her father. Not a warm letter. She didn't have that to give him, and she wasn't going to perform it. A clear letter. She told him what she'd done and what was coming. She told him that the deal he'd made with Dustin and with Farrow was about to be made public in a federal proceeding, and that if he had any interest in not being named as a willing participant in something that carried criminal weight, he'd want to consider what he knew and who he was willing to talk to. She didn't know if he'd read it or act on it. She sent it anyway. A person deserved to know what was coming. She wrote a second letter to Dustin and said fewer words in it because she had fewer words for him. Dade rode out with 4 deputies 2 days later, 2 from Casson City and 2 he'd sourced locally, and Elena rode with them, which she'd had to argue for. You don't need to be part of the arrest, Dade had said. I'm not going for the arrest, she'd said. I'm going because there are families involved in this that I know by name and you don't. And when you walk onto a property where frightened people have spent years being controlled by fear, you're going to need someone who can talk to them before they panic. Dade had looked at Colt. Don't look at him, Elena said. He can't answer for me. The marshal had been quiet for a moment. Then, you ride with us, you stay back when I say stay back. Agreed. She rode with them. They reached the Crossbar Ranch at mid-morning. Farrow was there. She'd wondered if he would be, if the 2 days would have given him enough warning to run. But he was there. Either he hadn't anticipated federal jurisdiction, or he'd calculated that running would confirm guilt he was still planning to argue against. He came out of the main house when the riders came through the gate, and he looked at the deputies' badges, and at Dade, and then his eyes found Elena, and whatever he'd been expecting, she was not it. She watched his face in the moment he recognized what had happened. Not panic. He was too controlled for panic, but a rapid internal revision, the look of a man restructuring his position in real time. Marshal, he said. Pleasant voice. Reasonable man caught off guard by a misunderstanding. This is unexpected. I have warrants, Mr. Farrow, Dade said, for your arrest and for the search of these premises. On what grounds? Dade handed him the warrant, which Elena knew listed 7 specific charges and the federal statute under which they were brought, because she'd read it twice while Dade's deputy was writing it out. Farrow read it. His expression didn't change, but something behind it changed. He looked at Elena again. "You were in my house," he said, not accusing, observing, like he was giving her credit for something he hadn't seen coming. "I was," she said. "I don't even know your name." "Elena Whitmore," she said. "Harlan Whitmore's daughter, the one your business associate sold you." A long moment. Cruz appeared in the doorway of the bunkhouse and read the situation, and his hand moved toward his hip, and Colt, who had positioned himself where he needed to be without anyone apparently watching him do it, said, "I wouldn't," in a voice that carried perfectly across the yard. Cruz's hand stopped. Farrow looked at the warrant one more time. Then he handed it back to Dade, with the deliberateness of a man who was already thinking about his lawyers and his version of events and the long road of contesting this that he intended to take. "I'll cooperate with the search," he said, which was what men like Farrow said when they were calculating rather than resigning. "That's good," Dade said. He nodded at his deputies. The search took the rest of the day. What the deputies found in the house and the East Wing went beyond what Elena had copied. There were additional records, things she hadn't found in the office cabinet, things that Farrow had apparently not considered vulnerable because no one had ever gotten this far before. There were also, in a trunk in the private sitting room, a series of letters, correspondence with individuals in Casson City and beyond, written in language that was careful but not careful enough, the kind of communications men write when they feel secure. One of the letters named both officials Elena had found in the contracts. Another named a third she hadn't seen before, someone in the territorial government with enough position that when Dade read that name, he went quiet in a way that meant it was significant. The families named in the contracts were contacted over the following days, through Dade's network and through Silas Wen, the postmaster in Ridgeline, who had held Elena's second copy carefully and had been, it turned out, already in communication with several of those families himself. They came forward one by one, cautiously, with the wariness of people who'd been burned by trusting authority before. Elena talked to some of them herself, which Dade allowed because she'd been right about the value of someone they could look at who wasn't wearing a badge. The Mercer family came. A woman named Rose Henning, who'd spent 3 years at a property 2 counties east and had made her own way out 18 months ago and had been living under a different name in Dalton ever since. A man named Gordo Carver, who'd signed a contract he hadn't understood for his sister's freedom and had been paying on it for 4 years and still didn't know if the payment was real. She sat with each of them, and she listened, and she was not able to tell them that everything was going to be resolved cleanly, because it wasn't going to be. There was no version of this where the years came back or the damage was undone. What she could tell them was that what they'd experienced was documented and named and was going to be treated as the crime it was. And that was not everything, but it was something real. Dustin Whitmore arrived at the federal proceedings in Ardmore 11 days later, not as a witness she'd been expecting, but as a subject. Dade had widened the investigation's scope, and Dustin's name appeared in 3 of the contracts as a referring party, someone who'd brought families to Farrow's attention in exchange for debt relief. She saw him in the hall outside the proceedings room. He looked diminished. That was the word that came to her. Not smaller physically, but diminished. The particular deflation of a man whose schemes had depended on everyone around him having less information than he did, and who was now in a room where that was no longer the case. He saw her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "I didn't know it went this deep," he said finally. He seemed to mean it, which made it worse rather than better, because it meant he'd participated in something he hadn't even thought important enough to fully understand. "You knew enough," she said. "Elena, you told our father she just has to go." She kept her voice level. Not cold. Level. "You didn't know the full depth of it because you didn't want to know. That's not innocence, Dustin. That's just a different kind of choice." He didn't have anything to say to that. She walked past him into the proceedings. Harlan Whitmore did not appear at the proceedings. What he did, apparently, was present himself to a local magistrate in Ridgeline 4 days after receiving Elena's letter, offer a statement about what he knew of the arrangement with Farrow, and in exchange for that cooperation, receive a formal caution rather than a charge. She heard about it secondhand from Silas Wen, who'd written a short note that made clear he didn't have strong feelings about the outcome either way and thought she should know. She sat with the note for a while. She thought about what she felt about it, which was not simple. She didn't want her father imprisoned. She'd examined that, and it was true. What she'd wanted, without knowing how to name it, was for him to look at what he'd done and understand it clearly, and maybe the magistrate's room was the closest thing to that he was going to achieve. It wasn't satisfaction, it was just the shape that reality took when you stopped expecting it to look like the ending you'd imagined. She folded the note and put it away, and she didn't think about it again for a long time. Wade Farrow's arrest processed through the federal system with the particular grinding slowness of institutions confronting men with resources. His lawyers were good. They contested jurisdiction on 2 counts and argued the provenance of the evidence on 3 more, and they were not wrong that some of what Elena had obtained sat in a legally complicated position. What they couldn't contest was the testimony. 21 people testified over the course of 3 proceedings. Women and men who had been caught in Farrow's system and who came, one by one, into rooms with judges and federal representatives and said what had been done to them in terms that could not be legally restructured. Elena testified twice, once about what she'd personally witnessed in the documents, and once about the night she'd left her family's farm, which was the night the chain of events had started, and that second testimony was the harder one. She told it straight. She didn't dress it up. She said what had been said on the stairs and what she'd taken when she left, and how cold it was, and what the canyon had looked like when the riders appeared. And she said Colt Maddox had pulled her out of that canyon, and she would not have made it without him, and that was simply true. The judge was a woman named Adele Marsh, which was unusual enough that Elena had noted it immediately, and which she thought about afterward. The particular quality of being heard by someone who understood from the inside what the word sold implied for a person who couldn't sell themselves back. Judge Marsh's rulings were not emotional. They were precise. She found for the federal charges on 4 of the 7 counts, referred the additional 3 to Casson City for territorial proceedings, and issued an order for the return of properties and compensation where compensation could be calculated. Farrow's expression during the readings was the expression of a man who still believed, on some fundamental level, that this was a problem he would eventually manage his way out of. Maybe he would. Men with money in federal systems were unpredictable, but he was looking at years of legal proceedings with his operation dismantled and his name on federal warrants, and the people he'd relied on in Casson City were suddenly very interested in demonstrating their own cooperation with the investigation. The thing about men who built their power on other people's silence was that silence was a reversible condition. The ranch the Mercer family got back wasn't in the condition they'd left it. Elena went with Silas when the property order was executed, not because she needed to be there, but because she wanted to see it. She wanted to see a family walk back onto land that had been taken from them, and she wanted that to be a real thing she'd witnessed rather than a fact she'd heard about. It was not a clean moment. The Mercer farmhouse had been used for storage, and 2 windows were broken, and the fencing on the east side had been pulled down. And Thomas Mercer, who was 61 and looked older, walked through the front door of his house and stood in the main room and didn't say anything for a long time. His wife stood beside him and held his hand. Elena stood in the doorway and watched, and she thought about $14 in a floorboard and 4 months of early mornings and a horse that trusted her, and she thought about the version of this that didn't happen. The version where she stayed on the stairs that January night and didn't understand what she'd heard or understood and decided there was nothing she could do. She was glad she'd gone out the window. She turned back to the yard where Colt was waiting with the horses, because he'd come and he always came, but he understood about not crowding a moment that didn't belong to him. "Well?" he said. She looked at the Mercer farmhouse. Thomas Mercer had come back to the doorway and was looking at his land with the expression of a man relearning that something was his. "1 down," she said. Colt looked at the farmhouse too. 17 more to process through the order. "Yes," she said. "I know." She took Pepper's reins. She put her foot in the stirrup. 17 more. Rose Henning and Gordo Carver, and the families she'd known by name from contracts, and the ones she hadn't known yet but would. The logging camp's records were still being worked through by Dade and a federal investigator from the east, and there were names in those routes that hadn't been located yet, People still somewhere in a system that was being dismantled, piece by piece. Clara Tibbs had been found 6 weeks after the warrants went out. She was in a property 3 counties east, exactly as Dade had suspected. She was alive. Elena had heard it described as adjusting, which was a careful word for something that would take longer than any legal proceeding. It wasn't a clean ending. Nothing about this was clean. But Thomas Mercer was standing in the doorway of his own house, and that was real. And Elena Whitmore was sitting on the horse she'd broken herself in the early mornings when no one was watching, and that was real too. She settled into the saddle. She rode. The valley looked different in spring. Elena noticed it the first morning she rode out to the Mercer place to help with the fence repair. The way the light came down through the new leaves differently than it had in January, softer and less certain, the kind of light that made the same landscape feel like a different country. 4 months had passed since she'd gone out that window in the dark. 4 months was not a long time by most measures. It felt like a decade. Thomas Mercer was already working the east fence when she arrived. His wife, Ada, came out of the farmhouse with coffee before Elena had fully dismounted, which was the kind of hospitality that came from genuine gratitude rather than obligation. And Elena had been on the receiving end of enough of both to know the difference. "You don't have to keep coming out here," Thomas said, not looking up from the post he was setting. "We've got it managed." "I know," Elena said. "I'm coming out because I want to." He glanced up at that. He had a weathered face that didn't give much away, but something in it acknowledged what she'd said without making an event of it. He nodded and went back to the fence post. She helped him with the east line for 3 hours. It was hard physical work, post setting and wire stringing in ground that was still half frozen underneath the surface thaw, and her hands were raw by the end of it, and she was grateful for that in a way that was hard to explain. There was something clarifying about work that was simply what it was. No subtext, no calculation, just a fence that needed to exist and the physical effort required to make it exist. Ada brought lunch out at noon, and the 3 of them ate sitting on the fence rail in the thin spring sun, and Thomas talked about what he was planning to plant and where the drainage problem was on the north field and how the barn roof needed attention before summer. Ordinary problems. The problems of a man managing his own land on his own terms. Elena ate her bread and listened and thought about how much this had cost him. Not the fence, not the roof, but the getting back to this point. 4 years of his daughter's absence, which had not resolved the way she'd hoped when she'd asked Dade about it. The Mercer girl, her name was Nora, had been located through the root records in the spring on a property far north, and she was alive and she was coming home. But Thomas Mercer had not yet seen her, and the not yet was a weight she could see in him, even in the ordinary conversation about drainage and planting. She didn't bring it up. He knew it better than she did. What she said, when the lunch was done and she was getting back on Pepper, was, "The Northfield drainage. There's a man named Gus Pruitt, farms the Hollow Creek property. He solved the same problem 3 seasons ago. Worth talking to him." Thomas looked up. "Pruitt. I know him." "He's good people," she said. She rode back toward Ridgeline, and the valley opened up around her in the spring light, and she thought about how it had looked 4 months ago, cold and dangerous, and full of the specific darkness of things operating in secret. It still wasn't simple. It was never going to be simple, but it was different in a way that had weight to it, the difference between a door that's locked and a door that's been opened, even if the room on the other side still needed work. The proceedings in Casson City concluded in March. Farrow received 7 years on the federal counts and was bound over on the territorial charges, which would add time depending on how those resolved. His lawyers had been good, and they would continue to be good, and there was a version of the future where he was out in 4 years on appeal and running something similar under a different structure. Elena had made her peace with not being able to control that version. What she could control was the documentation she'd handed to a federal investigator named Crane, who had come down from the east specifically for the root records from the logging camp. Crane was a careful, methodical man who reminded her faintly of Tibbs in his organizational habits, but whose conclusions were entirely different, and he had spent 6 weeks working through what she'd copied from the camp and what the originals had yielded in subsequent searches. The operation extended, as she'd suspected, well past the territory, 3 states, a network of receiving parties, a financing structure that had moved a significant amount of money for a significant number of years. Crane had been honest with her about what that meant. It was a long investigation. Multiple jurisdictions. The kind of thing that would take years to fully prosecute, if it fully prosecuted at all. She'd nodded and she'd asked him what she could do to help, and he'd said what he needed was for her written account of what she'd seen in the camp to be as detailed as possible, which she'd provided over 3 sessions in a room in the federal building in Ardmore, writing in the small, precise handwriting she'd developed keeping her father's farm accounts and never expected to use for anything like this. She'd asked him at the end of the last session about the 2 officials named in Pharaoh's correspondence. Crane had looked at her steadily. "Both have been removed from their positions," he said. "Charges are pending for one. The other cooperated early enough to negotiate a different outcome." "Is the different outcome fair?" "No," he said simply. "It rarely is. Cooperation has value in investigations, and the system reflects that regardless of whether the underlying offense warrants the consideration." He held her gaze. "That's an honest answer." She appreciated that he didn't dress it up. "Yes," she said. "It is." She walked out of the federal building into the March cold, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, and she thought about what fair meant and whether she'd been naive to think justice and fair were the same thing. She thought they weren't, and had probably never been, and that the work was to push the distance between them as small as possible rather than to expect they'd ever be identical. That was not a satisfying conclusion. It was a true one. Dustin's case resolved in April. He received a fine and 2 years probation, conditional on continued cooperation with the federal investigation. The cooperation clause was Dade's idea, and it was strategic. Dustin knew more about how families had been identified and targeted than he'd initially admitted, and that information had value. Elena had been consulted, obliquely, about whether she had objection to the arrangement. She'd thought about it for a day. What she'd said to Dade was, "I don't want him protected from what he did. I want the information to be useful." Dade had said, "That's what this does." "Then I don't object," she said. And then, because she was honest even when it was inconvenient, "I'm not going to tell you I forgive him. I'm not there. But I don't need him in prison to move forward. I need to know what he did was named and documented and cost him something." "It did," Dade said. She'd nodded and thanked him and gone back to her work, which by April had expanded in ways she hadn't anticipated. It started with Rose Henning. Rose had come back to Dalton after the federal proceedings, which was not the town she'd grown up in, but was the town she'd remade herself in while hiding under a different name, and she had nowhere specific to go and no particular resources, and a set of experiences she was not ready to discuss with most people. Elena had gone to see her in the boarding house where she was staying, which was not May Hollis's place but a similar one, small and clean and impersonal. They'd talked for 3 hours. Not about what had happened, not directly, not as a formal accounting, but about practical things, which was what Rose needed. Money, work, whether the dress shop on the main street was hiring, whether the boarding house rates were negotiable, the kind of conversation that was really about something else, about whether a person's ordinary life could be reassembled from the pieces, but that kept itself in the practical register because the other register was too much. By the end of the 3 hours, Elena had helped her draft a letter to the dress shop owner and identified 2 other women in Dalton who'd come out of Pharaoh's network and might be willing to speak with her. Not about the past, but just to know she wasn't alone in the present. She hadn't planned that visit. She'd gone because she'd thought of Rose and thought she should check. What came out of it was a clearer sense of what the gap was. The space between legal resolution and actual life reconstruction, which were not the same thing, and which the federal proceedings addressed approximately 0 of. She talked to Colt about it that evening, back at the ranch where she'd been staying since they'd returned from Ardmore. "There are women coming out of this without anywhere to land," she said. "The property orders help the families who had land. They don't help the people who were removed from those families and spent years somewhere else." "No," he said. "Someone needs to be keeping track of who's coming out and what they need." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. Crane has the federal records. Dade has the legal documentation. Nobody is keeping track of the people. Colt looked at her across the table. "Is this something you're asking me about or telling me?" She thought about that. telling you, she said. I think. He was quiet for a moment. You'll need resources, a place to work from, people you trust to help. Yes. Silas Wen would help. Ada Mercer, probably, when things are more settled for them. He paused. The retired lawman I told you about, Hadley. He knows these counties better than anyone, and he's been wanting a way to be useful. She looked at him. You've been thinking about this too. I've been thinking about what comes after for 4 years, he said. I just didn't know what shape it would take. She looked at her coffee. She thought about what her life had looked like 5 months ago. The farm, the cold room above the kitchen, the careful tracking of things she needed to keep hidden from people who held power over her. She thought about what it had looked like in her mother's ring on the wrong hand and $14 in a floorboard. I don't know how to run something like this, she said. You infiltrated a defended property, copied documents under time pressure, outran bounty hunters in a canyon, and talked a federal marshal into letting you ride with his deputies, Colt said. I think you'll figure it out. She almost laughed. Almost. That's not the same thing. It's the same thing, he said. Different terrain. By summer, there were 7 of them. Elena, Silas Wen, Ada Mercer, a woman named Pauline Cross who'd been a school teacher before Pharaoh's operation touched her family, and who had a particular gift for keeping track of complicated information across multiple cases. A man named Voss, who'd come out of the network as a victim himself and had decided that being useful was the best way he knew to make sense of what had happened to him. Hadley, the retired lawman who knew which roads went where and which officials were trustworthy and which ones were still being investigated. And Colt, who contributed in the specific ways that Colt contributed: practical support, physical presence when it was needed, and a network of contacts across the territory that had been built up over 4 years of patient watching and was now being put to a different use. They called it a working group, which was a deliberately modest name for what it was doing. Finding people coming out of Pharaoh's network and beyond it, because Crane's investigation had confirmed there were other operations in other territories using similar structures, and the working group wasn't limiting itself to what Pharaoh specifically had built. Connecting those people with resources, legal support where it was needed, practical help where it was needed, documentation of cases that the federal investigation could use, but that were also simply records, a way of making sure that what had happened was not eventually forgotten or minimized or absorbed into the general silence. It was slow work. It was incomplete work. It produced results that were sometimes satisfying and sometimes devastating, and often somewhere in the complicated middle, where a person was better off than they'd been, but not as well off as they deserved. Elena drove herself through it with the same stubbornness that had gotten her out the window in January. Some weeks it was enough. Some weeks she sat at the table with the case files spread in front of her, and she was overwhelmed by the size of what they were trying to address versus what they could actually do. And she had to sit with that without letting it stop her. She'd gotten better at sitting with things she couldn't fix. That was not the same as being at peace with them. It was just a skill she was developing, the way she'd developed the skill of moving through a dark house without making a sound, practical and necessary and imperfect. Clara Tibbs arrived in Ridgeline on a Thursday in July. Elena hadn't been expecting her. She'd known Clara was coming home eventually, that she'd been in contact with her family and with Dade's office, but the specific timing hadn't been communicated. She was at Silas Wen's postal office going over case correspondence when Silas looked up from the window and said, "That's the Tibbs girl." Elena looked out the window. Clara Tibbs was 22 years old, the same age as Elena, and she was walking down the main street of Ridgeline with a carpet bag and the particular quality of movement that Elena recognized immediately: the alertness, the automatic assessment of exits and people and spaces, the way someone moves when they've spent a long time in places where awareness was survival. She was not the person she would have been if none of this had happened. Nobody was. Elena went outside. "Clara," she said. The young woman stopped. She had dark eyes that were cautious and a face that had the same hard-won quality Elena saw in her own mirror sometimes. "You're Elena Whitmore," she said. "Yes." "Colt's told me about you." A pause. "In letters. He wrote to my family through Hadley. He didn't sign them, but Hadley said they were from him." Elena hadn't known about the letters. She filed that away and thought about a man who'd been working toward this for 4 years, keeping contact with a missing girl's family through the careful distance of unsigned correspondence. "He's a private person," Elena said. "Hadley said you're the one who got the documents." "Colt got me out of the canyon first," Elena said. "It was both of us." Clara looked at her for a moment. She seemed to be deciding something. "I don't know how to talk about what happened to me," she said. "Not yet. Maybe not for a long time." "That's all right," Elena said. "Nobody's asking you to." "I just want—" She stopped, started again. "I just want someone to tell me that ordinary things are still possible, that I can have an ordinary week where nothing extraordinary happens." Her voice was steady in the way of someone who'd had to get their voice under control and kept it there. "Is that—" "Yes," Elena said. "That's possible." She meant it. Not as comfort, but as fact. "It takes a while, but yes." Clara Tibbs looked at her for a moment longer. Then she nodded once, and she picked up her carpet bag, and she walked toward the house at the end of the street where her family was waiting. Elena watched her go. She stood on the main street of Ridgeline in the July sun, and she thought about all the things she couldn't give that girl back. The years, the choice, the version of herself that would have existed without any of this. Those things were gone, and no legal proceeding and no working group and no amount of careful documentation would retrieve them. What remained was what remained. The present, which was real, and the future, which was still possible. That had to be enough. It was enough. She decided to believe it was enough because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not something she knew how to do. Colt was fixing the barn roof when she got back to the ranch that evening. She stood in the yard and looked up at him for a moment. He was working with the particular focused efficiency that characterized everything he did. Not fast, but not wasted. Exactly what the task required, and nothing extra. He'd been working on the barn roof for 3 days. At some point, she'd started thinking of it as their barn, rather than his barn, which was a shift she hadn't marked when it happened. She thought about that. She climbed up the ladder and sat on the edge of the roof beside where he was working, which he accepted without comment. "Clara Tibbs came home today," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He set down the tool he was using. How did she seem? Like someone who went through what she went through. She looked at the valley spread below them in the evening light. "She'll be all right. Not right away. But she'll be all right." He picked up the tool again. "You don't know that for certain." "No," she agreed. "But I think it's true, and I'm choosing to believe it." He looked at her sideways. "Is that your general approach now? Choosing what to believe?" "Only for things I can't know for certain," she said. "For things I can know for certain, I use evidence." Something in his expression moved in the way it did sometimes. Not a smile exactly, more like the place where a smile lived when it wasn't actively present. "That seems reasonable," he said. She looked at the valley. The Mercer place was visible from here, a small square of buildings and fields in the distance, fence line on the east that she'd helped set 3 months ago. Rose Henning was in Dalton. Gordo Carver had his sister back and was trying to reconstruct 4 years of a relationship with a person who'd been changed by them. Clara Tibbs was walking through the door of her family's home. Not everything. Not even most things, when she thought about the full scope of what Crane was still unwinding, what the network had touched across 3 states, and how many names hadn't been accounted for yet. But some things. Real things. "I've been thinking about staying," she said. Colt stopped working. "Not permanently, necessarily," she said, which was not quite what she meant, but was an easier way to start. "I mean, the working group needs a base, something more stable than Silas Wen's back office, and the valley is where most of the cases are centered. It makes practical sense to be here." He was very still in the way he sometimes was. "And," she said, because she'd decided she was done with indirect approaches to things that mattered, "I'm not in a hurry to be anywhere else." She looked at him. "If that's something you're amenable to." He looked back at her. The evening light was doing something to the quality of his face, softening the edges of all that careful hardness, and she thought about the man she'd seen him be over the past 5 months. Not the man of the ghost stories and the frontier reputation, the one who made hired guns back up in yards, But the man who'd left a lamp-coated signal system for a woman he'd met 1 week earlier, who'd written unsigned letters to a missing girl's family for 4 years, who'd said, "You're going to be all right," with the plainness of someone who didn't offer things he didn't mean. Amenable, he said slowly, like he was examining the word. "Yeah, I'd say that." She looked back at the valley. She didn't make it into more than it was. She just let it be what it was, which was something real between two people who'd both spent too long in situations that weren't, and that was enough. More than enough. Boom. The community meeting in September drew 43 people to the Ridgeline Assembly Hall, which was not a large building and was significantly uncomfortable with 43 people in it, but nobody left. Elena had organized it, with help from Ada Mercer and Pauline Cross and Silas Wen, and the stated purpose was simple: an accounting of what had happened in the territory, presented to the people who'd lived through it, and a conversation about what structures needed to exist going forward to make sure it didn't happen again. She stood up in front of those 43 people, ranchers and farmers and townspeople, and people who'd come out of Pharaoh's network, and people who'd watched from the edges not knowing what they were watching. And she was aware that she was 22 years old and had no official standing, and had spent the first 2 decades of her life being treated as someone who didn't have standing, and she was doing it anyway. She told them what had happened, not her personal story. She'd told that to enough federal officials and didn't need to give it to a room. She told them what the documents showed, in plain terms: how it worked, how families were identified and targeted, how debt became leverage, became control, became something that had been happening in their territory for years, while most of them suspected pieces of it but couldn't see the whole. Nobody interrupted her. When she was done, Thomas Mercer stood up, which she hadn't expected, and said, "My daughter's coming home next month." He said it to the room, not to her specifically. "I'm telling you that so you know that some things that looked permanent weren't. And so you know that the people in this room who made that possible deserve the same respect from this community that any man who shot his way to a solution would have gotten. More, probably." 43 people in an uncomfortable building were quiet for a moment. Then a man she didn't know well, a rancher named Boone from the east side of the valley, said, "What do we need to do going forward?" She told them. She talked for another hour. She talked about the structures Pharaoh had used and where communities were vulnerable, and what kinds of cooperative arrangements between ranching families would make them harder to isolate and pressure. She talked about the working group and what it was doing and what it needed. She talked about debt, about how men in desperate circumstances were the entry point for most of what had happened, and how that meant financial desperation in a community was not a private matter, but a communal vulnerability. Some people pushed back. A man named Graves said he didn't see why his operation was anyone else's business if he ran into trouble. A woman named Petty said the government involvement made her nervous in ways she'd explain later. 2 or 3 people were clearly still uncertain about trusting anything that had the word federal attached to it, which was understandable, and she didn't dismiss it. She said, "I'm not telling you what you have to do. I'm telling you what I've learned about how a community gets taken apart, and asking you to think about what you want the alternative to look like." She looked at the room. "I'm 22 years old. I don't have all the answers. I have some of them, and I have a lot of people around me who have different ones. We're all going to have to figure out the rest together." Graves sat back. He didn't agree, but he didn't leave. Nobody left. After the meeting, when the hall had mostly emptied and she was helping Ada stack chairs, Ada said, "Your mother would have liked to see this." Elena stopped. She hadn't talked about her mother to Ada. Ada knew about Harlan Whitmore in the general way that people in communities know about each other, and she'd probably heard enough to construct a picture. "Maybe," Elena said. "Not maybe." Ada set a chair on the stack. "A woman who raised a daughter like you liked something right. That comes from somewhere." Elena thought about the ring in her pocket, the thin gold one with the garnet. She'd moved it back to her left hand sometime in March. She wasn't sure exactly when. It had just seemed right to have it there, close. "She was stubborn," Elena said. "That's probably where it comes from." Ada smiled. "Most good things do." Elena stacked the last chair and looked around the empty hall. The knocked-together chairs, and the drafty windows, and the floor that needed replacing in the northeast corner. An imperfect building that had held 43 people talking honestly about something difficult. She picked up her coat. She went outside to where Colt was waiting with the horses in the cool September evening, and she told him how it went. And he listened the way he listened, and they rode home through the dark the way they'd ridden through the dark before. Except now the dark was different because she knew every turn of this road, and there was a lamp lit at the ranch window, and nobody on this ridge was looking for her anymore. She thought about the night she'd come over this same ridge. January, frozen ground, bounty hunters behind her, $14 and a horse, and no plan except Away. She thought about what Away had turned into. Not a clean story. Not the kind of story where the ending resolves every wound, and the right people get exactly what they deserve, and the people who were hurt come back to themselves completely. That wasn't the story. The story was messier than that and truer than that, and it wasn't over, really. Clara Tibbs was still adjusting, Crane was still investigating. There were names on route records that still didn't have faces, and tomorrow the work continued. But she was here, on her own horse, on her own terms, riding toward a place that was hers to be in. That was not nothing. That was not nothing at all. She'd been sold like a debt someone wanted to forget, and she'd come back as something else entirely. Not harder, not colder, not the kind of woman who'd burned away everything soft in herself to survive. Just herself. More completely than she'd ever been allowed to be. A woman who'd learned that the things people try to take from you are often the things that were never theirs to take. The ranch came into view ahead, the lamp in the window yellow in the dark. She rode toward it. She was home.